Imagine trying to cut through wood with nothing but a sharp stone in your hand. Every strike sends the shock through your fingers, into your wrist, up your arm, and back into your body. The harder you swing, the more punishment you absorb. For early humans, this wasn't a failed experiment. It was cutting-edge technology. Long before humans developed the familiar handled axe, our ancestors were already shaping rocks into highly effective cutting tools. Some of the earliest examples come from East Africa, dating back roughly 76 million years, associated with early Acheulean toolmakers and populations linked to Homo erectus and later human groups. Despite the name, these were not axes in the modern sense. There was no handle, no binding, no adhesive. Just a carefully shaped stone held directly in the hand. A symmetrical stone could cut meat, scrape hides, break apart roots, and shape wood. And this basic hand axe tradition endured for more than 1 million years across vast regions and different human populations, not unchanged in detail. Its size, shape, materials, and craftsmanship varied, but the core idea remained remarkably consistent. Shape the stone, create a sharp working edge, use it directly by hand. Yet the design had an obvious limitation. The hand absorbed every impact. Each blow traveled through bone and muscle. Swinging harder increased strain. Heavy woodworking remained extremely inefficient. Something essential was missing. The stone needed to be combined with something else. It needed a handle. With a handle, the tool could deliver greater reach, leverage, and momentum. The axe was no longer just a shaped stone. It was becoming a system for directing human strength, a machine for multiplying human effort. But attaching stone to wood was only part of the breakthrough. The deeper challenge was planning how separate materials could work together before the finished tool even existed. Attaching a sharp stone to a wooden handle may sound straightforward today, but in reality, it required solving several problems at once. The stone had to be shaped so it could be securely fixed. The handle had to survive repeated impacts. And whatever joined the two materials had to hold under intense force. This is where hafting becomes crucial. A hafted tool is a composite system. It combines different materials to perform a task more effectively than any one material could alone. Different combinations of stone, wood, fiber, and natural adhesives could create these composite tools. The stone provided the working edge. A wooden shaft offered reach and mechanical advantage. Fiber bindings could secure the components. And in some cases, natural adhesives reinforced the connection. Importantly, this was not a single invention appearing all at once. It was a long process of experimentation, with different materials being combined in different ways. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans and Neanderthals were developing aspects of this technology long before metal tools existed. At Sibudu Cave in South Africa, evidence dating to roughly 70,000 years ago suggests the use of compound adhesives combining plant materials with red ochre. The important point is not simply that adhesive existed, it is that producing it required gathering, processing, and combining different ingredients into a usable bonding material. Even earlier evidence comes from Neanderthal sites. Researchers have identified Neanderthal-associated birch bark tar dating back roughly 190,000 years, produced by heating bark under oxygen-limited conditions. Other discoveries show that ancient people also produced cordage and fiber materials that could have served as bindings in tool construction. None of this allows us to pinpoint exactly when the first hafted axe appeared. Organic materials rarely survive, and tool-making traditions varied across regions and time. But the evidence reveals something important. The building blocks of composite technology were already in place long before axes reached their later forms. Stone, wood, fiber, and adhesives were not discovered in a neat sequence. They were gradually explored, tested, and combined in different ways. But when did these separate innovations finally come together to create the axe forms we recognize from the archaeological record? If the basic ingredients for composite tools already existed, the real question becomes more specific. When do we first see an edge-ground stone tool designed to work as part of a larger system with a handle? One of the most striking answers comes from northern Australia. At Majidbe, researchers uncovered evidence of edge-ground stone hatchets dating to roughly 65,000 years ago. This was not simply a new way of sharpening stone. It represented a significant change in how stone tools could be manufactured and maintained. Earlier stone tools were typically produced by striking flakes from a core, shaping edges through controlled breakage. Grinding introduced another method. The maker could grind parts of the stone against a hard surface, gradually shaping and refining the cutting edge. This required additional time, planning, and sustained effort, but it produced a carefully controlled and durable working edge. Placed in a global context, the Majidbe evidence is especially significant. It points to an exceptionally early development of ground-edge axe technology in Australia, long before similar traditions became widespread in many other regions. These tools were not identical to modern axes, but their form and manufacturing traces indicate they were part of a deliberate system of hafted, edge-ground implements. A ground edge could be maintained and resharpened over time. A stone head could be fitted fitted to a wooden handle. Together, they formed a tool capable of repeated, controlled impact far beyond what a handheld stone could achieve. The result was a tool capable of sustained cutting and impact, opening new possibilities for working wood and other materials. Tasks that once required extreme effort could now be approached with greater control and efficiency. The axe was no longer just a cutting object. It was becoming a means of reshaping the environment itself. And yet, for tens of thousands of years, this technology remained regionally limited. Then, much later, another transformation began to spread across Europe. Stone axes were polished to a fine finish. Agricultural communities expanded, and forests began to disappear under sustained human activity. But polishing stone was only the beginning of a much larger shift. Because once humans learned to refine stone axes to remarkable levels of precision, they were about to discover something far more powerful than stone could ever become. For thousands of years, the axe was primarily a tool for individual tasks, cutting wood, shaping timber, processing plants. But when farming spread into temperate Europe, its role began to change. Around the Neolithic period, agricultural communities moved into landscapes dominated by dense forest. If they wanted fields, they needed open ground, and that meant removing trees. A polished stone axe was well suited to the demanding work of cutting and shaping wood. Unlike a roughly chipped edge, a ground cutting edge could be maintained and resharpened for continued use against wood. The work remained physically intense. One tree could require dozens or even hundreds of strikes, but the tool made repeated woodland cutting more efficient, contributing to the gradual expansion of cleared land. Across parts of Europe, forests gradually gave way to cultivated fields, grazing areas, and settlements. But this transformation was not uniform. In many regions, tree cover declined over time, while in others, woodland persisted or changed more slowly depending on local conditions and farming practices. Pollen preserved in ancient lake sediments and peat deposits records this complexity. In many regions, tree pollen declines, cereal pollen increases. Plants associated with disturbed ground become more common. The landscape was changing, but not in a single, uniform way, and the axe was one of several technologies involved in that broader transformation. These tools were not always produced locally. One important example comes from Great Langdale in England's Lake District. Neolithic communities quarried a particularly tough volcanic rock there and shaped it into axe blanks. Some of these rough forms were transported elsewhere for further grinding and polishing. Finished axes moved through extensive exchange networks. Some were practical working tools. Others appear to have carried social meaning, with finely polished examples found far from their geological source. This suggests something important. The axe was no longer just equipment. It had become valuable enough to trade, display, and possibly use in maintaining relationships between communities. A simple cutting tool had entered a wider economic and social world, but stone would not remain humanity's most advanced material for long. In distant regions, a new substance was beginning to change everything. A metal that could be shaped by fire, transformed by heat, and eventually forged into blades far beyond what stone could achieve. The next transformation began when humans discovered something extraordinary. Certain rocks contained something that stone could never provide: metal. Copper was among the first metals to be widely used. Unlike stone, copper could be cast, hammered, reshaped, and repaired. It was softer than many high-quality stone edges, but it offered something entirely new. It could be melted and poured into shape. It could be reworked after damage. And when the edge wore down, it could be hammered and resharpened rather than simply discarded. One of the most famous examples comes from a man who died more than 5,000 years ago. In 1991, hikers discovered his body emerging from melting ice in the Alps, near the border between Austria and Italy. He became known as Otzi. Among the remarkable objects preserved with him was a copper axe. The blade was attached to a wooden handle using organic materials, forming a composite tool that combined metal, wood, and binding into a single system. Scientific analysis later showed that the copper came from southern Tuscany, hundreds of kilometers from where Otzi was found. Its distant copper source provides evidence of long-distance movement of materials across prehistoric Europe, and its manufacturing history reveals something even more important. People had learned to extract copper from ore through controlled heating. Instead of simply reshaping a solid material, humans were learning to extract and transform metal from ore. Copper technology opened the way to another major development. By alloying copper with metals such as tin, people produced bronze. This new material could offer greater hardness and durability than pure copper, opening new possibilities for tool and weapon design. Different axe designs appeared. Flanges could help secure the axe head to its handle, while later socketed forms enclosed the haft more effectively. Each variation reflected the same enduring challenge: how do you keep a cutting edge firmly attached while delivering maximum force? But bronze carried a hidden limitation. One of its key ingredients, tin, was relatively scarce and geographically unevenly distributed, making long-distance exchange increasingly important. And that dependency would soon push human metallurgy toward an even more transformative discovery. Bronze transformed the axe, but it also introduced a structural dependency. One of its key components was tin. While copper deposits were relatively widespread, usable tin sources were far more unevenly distributed. As bronze became central to tools, weapons, and prestige objects, many societies relied on long-distance exchange to secure the materials needed for production. But that system was vulnerable to disruption. Around the end of the Bronze Age, those networks began to experience major upheaval. Across the Eastern Mediterranean and parts of the Near East, several interconnected societies entered periods of instability. Trade routes were interrupted. Some urban centers were abandoned or significantly reduced. Political structures weakened or reorganized. The causes remain debated, involving environmental pressures, conflict, and broader systemic breakdowns rather than a single event. In some regions, access to the materials and networks supporting bronze production became more difficult, yet bronze did not disappear. In many areas, it continued to be produced and used for centuries alongside emerging technologies. One of those technologies was iron. Iron-bearing ores were far more widely distributed than the tin needed for bronze. But availability did not automatically mean easy production. Early ironworking required carefully controlled furnace conditions and temperatures high enough to reduce iron from its ores. Even after smelting, the resulting metal often needed extensive forging before it became useful. Iron did not replace bronze simply because it was superior. Its adoption was gradual, shaped by experimentation, regional knowledge, and changing economic conditions. Over time, ironworking techniques improved. Smiths learned to refine and shape the metal more effectively, making it suitable for a growing range of tools. As this knowledge spread, the axe entered another stage of its evolution. Its fundamental structure remained unchanged: a cutting edge, a handle, a secure connection between the two. But now the head could be made from a material that was not constrained by limited alloying resources. That gradually expanded where and how such tools could be produced and used. The axe had already survived transformations in stone, copper, and bronze. But iron would carry it into a new phase of human history, one where its presence extended far beyond elite workshops and into wider use across farms, workshops, ships, and battlefields. Iron changed the scale on which the axe could be made and used. As ironworking spread, durable metal axes became practical across wider regions and a broader range of everyday work. The basic design remained familiar: a metal cutting edge, a wooden handle, a connection strong enough to survive repeated impact. Iron did not replace earlier tools overnight, nor did it mean universal ownership, but it gradually expanded the regions and communities able to produce durable metal tools. The axe became part of everyday work. Farmers used axes to cut and shape timber. Builders relied on them to prepare beams and construct homes. Woodworkers used them to transform rough logs into usable material. And wherever forests stood between people and farmland, the axe became one of the tools capable of opening new ground. Its importance extended even farther. Wooden ships depended on enormous quantities of carefully prepared timber. Every beam, plank, mast, and structural component began with wood that had to be cut, split, shaped, and finished. The axe was one of the essential tools in that transformation. Few societies demonstrate this relationship more clearly than the Vikings. For them, the axe was both a practical implement and, in some contexts, a weapon. Swords were comparatively costly and often carried considerable prestige. Axes, by contrast, were versatile and widely used. The same basic technology could help build a house, prepare firewood, construct a boat, and, when circumstances demanded, serve in combat. Some Viking axes had broad, thin blades mounted on long wooden handles. Their shape gave them a distinctive combination of reach and cutting surface. Others had extended lower edges, or beards, that lengthened the cutting edge while allowing the blade to remain relatively thin. Different forms reflected different functional requirements. These were not simply crude tools turned into weapons, and that dual identity is important. The axe never stopped being a working tool. Even when it entered warfare, it remained connected to the ordinary activities that sustained communities. The same object could build and destroy, create shelter and break it apart, shape a ship and become part of a battle, but the axe's influence went beyond what it could physically cut. Across different civilizations, people began assigning the object deeper meanings: authority, status, religion, trade, and power, turning an ordinary tool into a symbol. The axe had already changed how humans worked. Now it began changing how humans communicated. Across different societies, the object acquired meanings far beyond cutting wood. It could represent authority, power, religious significance, social status, even wealth. One of the clearest examples comes from the Roman world. The fasces consisted of a bundle of rods associated with an axe blade and were carried as a symbol of official authority. The bundle came to represent magisterial power, while the axe was associated with the authority authority to punish. The symbol became closely connected with Roman political institutions and was later adopted in altered forms by other societies. But Rome was not alone in giving the axe symbolic importance. Across ancient cultures, distinctive axe forms appear in religious and ceremonial contexts. In the Minoan world of Bronze Age Crete, the double-headed axe became a particularly prominent symbol. It appears in archaeological contexts associated with ritual and elite culture. The object had acquired meanings far beyond its practical function. It had become part of a visual language of belief and power. The same transformation occurred through trade. As Europeans entered existing indigenous exchange networks in North America, iron axes and hatchets became important trade goods in parts of the continent. These tools were practical, durable, and useful for everyday life. That made them useful and desirable commodities within some regional trading systems. So the axe now occupied several worlds at once. It was a tool, a weapon, a trade object, a ritual symbol, a marker of status. And that versatility helps explain why the basic concept survived for so long. The axe could adapt to whatever society needed it to represent. But there is an even deeper reason the design remained so successful. The axe is not simply one material shaped into one object. It is a composite system. The head, handle, binding, and sometimes adhesive must work together. Each component has to function in relation to the others, or the tool becomes far less effective. And that simple fact reveals something much more profound than the history of a tool. To build an axe, humans had to coordinate several separate parts into a working system, a clue that takes us from archaeology toward deeper questions about planning, imagination, and human cognition. The axe looks simple: a head, a handle, something holding them together. But building one is anything but simple. Before the finished tool could be used, its maker had to coordinate a chain of separate tasks. The stone had to be selected, its shape had to be prepared, the handle had to be chosen, cut, and shaped. Binding material had to be available. If adhesive was needed, its ingredients had to be collected and processed beforehand, and every part had to fit the others. The maker could not rely entirely on solving each problem at the last moment. Some decisions had to anticipate how the finished components would work together. The stone head had to be shaped with the handle in mind. The handle had to match the size and form of the head. The binding had to work with both. A mistake in one stage could make the finished tool less effective or require the maker to start again. This is why composite technologies attract so much attention from researchers studying ancient cognition. They require information to be coordinated across multiple stages. Some steps had to be completed long before final assembly. The process required keeping track of what had already been prepared, what still needed to be done, and how each component would eventually function as part of one system. That does not tell us exactly what an ancient person's mind looked like. Archaeology cannot recover thoughts, but it can reveal increasingly complex chains of technological behavior, and those chains provide evidence for complex planning, problem solving, and coordination. The axe, therefore, represents more than a mechanical improvement. It represents a new relationship between thought and technology. A person could plan toward an object that did not yet exist, break its construction into separate stages, and bring those stages together into a functioning whole. The materials changed over time. The principle of composite design remained, but the story becomes even more remarkable when we stop treating the axe as one invention. Archaeology suggests that what we call the axe emerged through several technological breakthroughs spread across more than 1,000,000 years, and the sequence is hiding in plain sight. The history of the axe is not the story of one invention. It is a chain of inventions. Different communities inherited existing technologies in pair, and sometimes developed new ways to improve them. The Acheulean handaxe was shaped directly from stone. It gave humans a durable cutting edge without requiring wood, binding, or adhesive. But the user's hand still absorbed every impact. Then came the gradual development of hafted. Stone could be combined with wood, fiber, and natural adhesives. Now the cutting edge could be separated from the hand. The handle provided reach, leverage, and greater control over force. Much later, people developed ground-edge stone tools. Instead of creating the edge entirely through controlled fractures, they could grind it against another surface. The result was a different kind of cutting edge, one that could be maintained and refined for demanding work. In Australia, evidence from Majid B places ground-edge stone technology remarkably early. Elsewhere, polished stone axes became important parts of Neolithic societies. They were used to work timber and, alongside other technologies, contributed to the expansion of agricultural landscapes. Then metallurgy changed the material itself. Copper could be cast and hammered. Bronze opened new possibilities for alloying and tool design. Iron introduced another transformation, eventually becoming widely useful across many regions. Notice what remained constant through all these changes. The axe still needed a working edge. It still needed a handle, and the connection between them still mattered. The materials changed. The manufacturing techniques changed. The societies using the tools changed, but the basic engineering problem survived. How do you concentrate human effort into a controlled, repeatable impact? That question was answered differently again and again. Each solution opened new possibilities for working wood, stone, metal, and the landscapes around them. The axe, therefore, represents something larger than technological progress. It is evidence of cumulative innovation. One solution becomes the foundation for another. A small improvement can survive for generations before a completely new material or technique changes the possibilities again. And this is where the story leaves archaeology and enters the modern world, because the old problem of multiplying human strength did not disappear when machines arrived. It simply became larger, faster, and far more powerful. The materials changed, but the basic principle of the axe remained. Stone was followed by copper. Copper was combined into bronze. Iron gradually became dominant in many regions. Eventually, metal itself would be combined with materials that ancient toolmakers could never have imagined. But beneath all those changes was the same basic principle. Take a cutting edge, place it at the end of a handle. Then use the handle to direct human movement into a concentrated cutting force. That simple arrangement remained remarkably effective. For centuries, people depended on axes to transform forests into usable timber. A tree could become a beam could become a house, a log could become a boat, and a boat could carry people, goods, and entire communities across oceans. The axe, therefore, became part of a much larger technological system. It did not build a civilization by itself, but it was one of the tools that made working large quantities of wood practical. This becomes especially clear when we look at traditional shipbuilding. Large wooden vessels required enormous amounts of carefully shaped timber. The ability to fell trees and then remove, split, and shape their wood was fundamental to the process. The same principle applied to architecture. Homes, bridges, workshops, defensive structures, and religious buildings all depended on prepared timber. The axe was one of the tools that made many of these transformations possible. Then industrial technology began to change the equation. Machines could perform the cutting and shaping tasks that once demanded enormous amounts of human labor. Saws became larger and faster. Powered tools eventually replaced much of the physical work once performed manually. The exact machines would change, but the underlying cutting principle remained familiar. They apply force through an edge. They concentrate that force onto material. They remove or separate part of it. The technology became faster, more precise, more powerful. But the underlying mechanical idea remained surprisingly familiar. That is what makes the axe such an unusual invention. It was simple enough to survive countless technological revolutions. Its materials could change without destroying its basic concept. But there is one final transformation still missing from the story. The axe did not merely become stronger over time, it became increasingly specialized, with different designs emerging for different materials, environments, and tasks. Once the basic axe design was established, humans did not stop improving it. They started adapting it. Different tasks demanded different edges. Different environments created different problems. During the Bronze Age, axe makers experimented with ways to keep the metal head securely attached to its wooden handle. Some early bronze axes were relatively simple. Others developed raised edges or flanges along the sides. These helped stabilize the haft and protect the wooden handle around the blade. Some later designs introduced features such as stop ridges and attachment loops. Eventually came the socketed axe. Instead of placing the handle beneath or alongside the metal head, the axe head itself contained a hollow socket. The wooden haft fitted directly into the socket, creating a more enclosed and secure connection between head and handle. The same basic problem had been solved in a new way. Keep the edge secure, control how force reaches the haft, reduce the chance of failure. Ironworking expanded these possibilities even further. Iron could be forged into different blade profiles, allowing axes to specialize for particular tasks. Broad blades could suit heavy cutting, while narrower profiles could be adapted to more controlled work. Longer handles could increase reach and leverage, while shorter ones could provide greater maneuverability. By the medieval period, specialized axes appeared across different occupations and military traditions. Some were primarily woodworking tools, others were designed for combat. Still others combined practical and specialized functions. The important point is that there was no single perfect axe. There were many axes, each represented a solution to a particular problem. And that is a recurring pattern throughout technological history. Once humans understand a basic mechanism, they begin adapting it to increasingly specific needs. The axe followed much the same path. Its fundamental principle remained stable while its details multiplied. The result was not one final design, but an entire family of tools built around the same ancient idea. And that raises a fascinating question. If the axe could be redesigned again and again without losing its essential identity, what exactly made the original concept so powerful in the first place? So what made the axe such a successful design? The answer begins with something deceptively simple: leverage. A person's hand can generate only so much force on its own, but place a cutting edge at the end of a handle, and the user can swing it through a larger arc, generating speed and delivering that motion into the cutting edge. A longer haft can increase reach and leverage, while allowing the user to generate greater head speed during a controlled swing. the handle becomes more than something to hold. It gives the user greater control over the movement of the blade. The result is a tool that extends the user's reach while making each controlled strike more effective, but leverage alone is not enough. The shape of the cutting edge matters just as much. An axe does not need to slice through material like a knife. Instead, its edge is designed to concentrate impact and force material apart. The geometry allows the head to penetrate wood while the thickening blade acts like a wedge, forcing the material apart as it moves deeper. That makes the axe particularly effective for splitting and cutting timber. The material of the head matters too. Stone can produce a sharp and durable edge. Copper can be cast, hammered, and reshaped. Many bronze alloys offer greater hardness than pure copper and allow complex forms. Iron can be forged into specialized profiles and repeatedly maintained. Each material changed what the axe could accomplish, yet the underlying mechanism remained recognizable. The axe did not depend on one particular material. It depended on a relationship between edge, handle, force, and motion. That relationship could survive technological change. A stone head could be replaced by copper in some traditions. Copper could give way to bronze. Bronze could eventually be replaced by iron in many regions. The materials changed as human technologies, environments, and needs changed, but the mechanical logic remained useful. And this helps explain why the axe survived for so many thousands of years, even as countless other tools disappeared or became obsolete. It was not perfect. It was adaptable, but adaptability came with another consequence. Once humans learned that a tool could be optimized for a specific task, the axe began splitting into specialized forms, some of which could look almost nothing alike, yet still embody the same ancient principle at their core. Once humans understood that the axe could be adapted, there was no reason to stop at one design. Different jobs required different solutions. A person cutting down a large tree did not necessarily need the same axe as someone shaping a beam. A farmer clearing smaller growth needed something different again, and a warrior had entirely different priorities. So the axe gradually became a family of specialized tools. For heavy woodland work, broader blades could provide a substantial cutting surface. For shaping timber, narrower or differently profiled blades could offer greater control. For splitting wood, the geometry could emphasize the wedge effect rather than simply maximizing sharpness. Handle length changed too. A longer haft could increase reach and allow the user to generate greater head speed during a controlled swing. A shorter handle could make the tool easier to control in confined spaces. The head could become heavier or lighter depending on the task. Every change represented a trade-off. More power could mean less maneuverability. A thinner blade could cut efficiently but require greater care. A heavier head could deliver stronger impacts but demand more physical effort. This adaptation extended beyond ordinary woodworking. In agricultural societies, different tools and axe forms were used for clearing vegetation, preparing timber, and maintaining cultivated landscapes. Builders needed axes capable of shaping structural wood with precision. Shipwrights required tools suited to transforming massive logs into carefully fitted components. Military traditions developed their own specialized forms, where reach, balance, cutting ability, and control became critical. The important point is that technological progress did not always mean replacing an old tool with a completely new one. Sometimes it meant taking an existing idea and tuning every part of it for a particular purpose. That is why axes from different periods can look dramatically different while still sharing the same underlying architecture. A cutting edge, a handle, a way to transfer force, a solution to a specific human problem. And once that principle became deeply established, it proved remarkably difficult to eliminate. But eventually, something appeared that could challenge the axe in a completely different way. Not a better blade, not a stronger metal, a machine that could perform the cutting again and again without relying on human muscle. For thousands of years, cutting a tree required one thing above all else: human muscle. Every strike began with a person lifting the axe. Every cut required another swing, and every tree represented another test of endurance. Then machines began changing the equation. The industrial era introduced powered equipment capable of doing work that had once demanded hours of physical labor. The principle was familiar: apply force through a cutting edge. But now the source of that force was no longer the human body. Steam engines, internal combustion engines, and eventually electric motors allowed machines to sustain cutting operations far beyond the endurance of a human worker. Forestry changed dramatically. Tasks that once depended on individual workers could increasingly be performed with specialized machinery. Trees could be felled more quickly, logs could be processed more efficiently, and large quantities of timber could move through industrial systems at an unprecedented scale. The axe did not disappear immediately. Far from it. Hand axes continued to be useful for tasks where portability, access, or controlled cutting mattered more than raw speed. But the balance had shifted. The machine could repeat its cutting operation continuously, without the fatigue that limited human workers. That represented something fundamentally different from improving the axe head. Instead of making the tool more efficient. Humans were replacing the source of its power. This was a recurring pattern in technological history. First, humans improved materials. Then they improved design. Then they found ways to multiply physical effort. Eventually, they began building machines that could perform entire sequences of work with far less direct human effort. The ancient axe had helped humans overcome the limits of their bodies. Industrial machinery pushed that idea much further. And yet, something strangely familiar remained. A modern chainsaw may look nothing like a prehistoric hand axe. A mechanical harvester may bear little resemblance to a polished stone tool. But both pursue a remarkably similar objective. Use a cutting edge to transform material with greater efficiency. The technology had become faster, louder, more powerful. But the underlying challenge remained surprisingly familiar. And that leaves us with the final question. After more than 1,000,000 years of stone, wood, copper, bronze, iron, and machines, what does the story of the axe actually tell us about human innovation? After more than 1,000,000 years, the axe still carries the outline of its ancient ancestor. A cutting edge, a handle, a connection between the two. Everything else changed. The materials changed. The manufacturing changed. The people who used it changed. And the problems it solved became increasingly complex. Early stone tools gave humans cutting edges far more effective than their hands alone could provide. Hafting allowed stone edges to be mounted on handles, introducing greater reach, leverage, and control. Ground edge technology refined the cutting surface. Polished stone axes became important tools in agricultural societies. Copper introduced a material that could be cast and reshaped. Bronze expanded the possibilities of metalworking. Iron eventually allowed durable metal tools to spread across much wider regions. Then specialization created entire families of axes designed for different tasks. Finally, machines began supplying the force that human muscles had provided for thousands of years. Yet through every transformation, one principle survived. Humans repeatedly found ways to turn limited physical effort into greater reach, speed, control, and practical effect. That may be the most important lesson in the entire story. The axe was never simply about cutting wood. It was about extending human capability. A relatively small amount of effort could be directed through a tool to produce a much larger practical result. And as those solutions proved useful, humans kept asking the same questions in different forms. Can this be made stronger, sharper, lighter, more durable, more precise, faster? Those questions helped drive the transition from stone to metal, from hand tools to machines, and from simple mechanical solutions to increasingly complex technologies. The axe, therefore, represents something much larger than one ancient invention. It is a record of cumulative human problem solving. An idea survives, someone modifies it, another generation improves it, a new material changes what is possible, and eventually, the original concept becomes almost unrecognizable while its fundamental principle remains. That is why the axe matters. Not because it was the most sophisticated tool humans ever created, but because it was one of the clearest examples of how a simple idea can survive for an extraordinary length of time. The earliest axe-like tools gave humans a way to turn the motion of a single swing into a far greater cutting effect. More than 1,000,000 years later, our machines are pursuing the same basic goal on a scale those first toolmakers could never have imagined.